When the earth split open beneath Jacob Hartwell's Montana ranch in 1881, revealing an ancient tunnel carved with mysterious symbols, the lonely rancher thought he'd simply found old mining ruin. But as word of his discovery spread across the territory like wildfire, bringing treasure hunters, scholars, and railroad magnates to his doorstep, Jacob realized he'd uncovered something that powerful men would kill for evidence of a lost civilization that wasn't supposed to exist. What secrets lay buried in that stone chest at the tunnel's heart? And why were some people so desperate to claim them that they'd destroy a man's life to get them? Jacob Hartwell's boots hit the porch with a hollow thud that echoed across the empty Montana plains. The sound bounced off nothing but silence, no cattle calling, no neighbors chatting. Just the kind of quiet that makes a man wonder if the world forgot he exists. September morning light painted his small ranch house golden, but Jacob felt gray inside. 3 years had passed since Martha died from the fever, and every sunrise reminded him of breakfast conversations he'd never have again. He poured coffee from the dented pot she'd used, the metal still warm from the stove she'd loved to fuss over. "Another day," he whispered to the empty kitchen, then stepped outside to check his land. The Montana territory stretched endlessly before him, rolling hills covered in prairie grass that whispered secrets to the wind. His 200 acres weren't much compared to the big spreads owned by men like Cornelius Blake, but they were his. Every fence post, every struggling crop, every stubborn cow bore the mark of his sweat and determination. Jacob pulled his hat down tight as he walked toward the barn. Duchess, his brown mare, nickered softly when she saw him coming. At least someone was happy to see him these days. "Morning, girl," he said, scratching behind her ears. "Ready for another ride around our little kingdom?" The neighboring ranchers had made their feelings clear about Jacob. At the general store, conversations stopped when he entered. At church, families sat closer together when he walked past their pews. They believed a man who couldn't protect his wife from sickness couldn't be trusted with much else. Jacob saddled Duchess and rode out to check the northern fence line. The September air carried hints of the coming winter, that sharp bite that warned of snow and long nights ahead. He'd face them alone, just like the 3 winters before. The fence needed mending where cattle had pushed against it, searching for greener grass on the other side. Jacob dismounted and pulled tools from his saddlebag. The work felt good, something real he could fix with his hand. As he hammered a loose nail, memories drifted back to better times. Martha laughing as she chased chickens around the yard, her voice calling him in for supper when the sun painted the sky orange. The way she'd hum while kneading bread, filling their home with music. "Stop it," Jacob told himself firmly. "She's gone. No point living in yesterday." But yesterday felt safer than today. Yesterday had hope. Today held only endless repetition of the same lonely tasks, the same quiet meals, the same cold bed. A hawk circled overhead, riding invisible currents of air with graceful ease. Jacob envied its freedom. The bird could soar anywhere, see everything from above, choose any direction without explanation or judgment. He finished the fence repair and moved to the next section. The morning sun climbed higher, promising another hot day. Duchess grazed nearby, her reins loose around the saddle horn. She trusted Jacob to keep them both safe, though he wondered sometimes if her faith was misplaced. The next fence post leaned dangerously to one side. Jacob dug around its base, trying to understand why it had shifted. The ground felt loose, almost hollow, strained. This section of land had always been solid before. He dug deeper, curious now. The soil came away easily, too easily. Something wasn't right about the way the earth behaved here. It felt different under his shovel lighter, as if air pockets existed below the surface. Jacob wiped sweat from his forehead and looked around. The landscape appeared normal enough. Rolling hills, scattered rocks, patches of sagebrush dancing in the breeze. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain the odd feeling beneath his feet. A meadowlark sang from a nearby boulder, its yellow chest bright against the gray stone. The sound broke the morning stillness, like a bell, clear and pure. Martha had loved meadowlarks. She'd always stopped whatever she was doing to listen when they sang. Beautiful music, she'd say. God's way of reminding us that joy still exists, even in hard times. Jacob finished strengthening the fence post and mounted Duchess again. They rode along the property line, checking for other problems. The mare's hooves drummed a steady rhythm against the packed earth, clip-clop like a heartbeat, marking time. Near the creek that bordered his land, Jacob found calf tracks in the mud. The prints looked fresh, maybe from last night. Good news. His small herd was healthy and moving around freely. Healthy cattle meant he could afford winter supplies and maybe even have money left over. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. Jacob knelt and cupped some in his hands, drinking deeply. It tasted clean and sweet, better than anything he could buy in town. Simple pleasures like cold water on a hot day reminded him that life still offered gifts, even to lonely men. As he stood, something caught his eye across the creek. Fresh scratches marked a large cottonwood tree, long, deep gouges in the bark, about 8 feet off the ground. Bear claws, a big bear, from the look of things. Jacob's hand moved instinctively to the rifle in his saddle holster. He'd heard stories about problem bears in the area, animals that had lost their fear of humans and grown bold enough to attack livestock. The last thing he needed was a bear deciding his cattle looked tasty. He studied the scratches more carefully. They appeared recent. No sap had dried over them yet. The bear might still be nearby, watching him even now from the shadows of the forest. Jacob felt the hair on his neck stand up as he scanned the tree line for movement. Nothing. Just trees swaying gently in the breeze and birds flitting between branches. But bears were patient hunters. They could wait for hours without moving, then strike faster than lightning when the moment was right. Jacob mounted Duchess and headed home, keeping alert for any sign of danger. The morning had started peacefully enough, but now tension crept into his shoulders. A man alone had to stay ready for trouble, because trouble always seemed to find him eventually. The ranch house came into view as they topped the last hill. Smoke still curled from the chimney where he'd banked the morning fire. Home looked small and fragile against the vast landscape, like a single candle trying to hold back an ocean of darkness. But it was his candle, his light in the wilderness. And despite the loneliness that lived in every room, despite the memories that haunted every corner, it was the only place on earth where Jacob Hartwell belonged. The earth moved like a sleeping giant, rolling over in its bed. Jacob felt the tremor begin in his boots. First, a vibration so low and deep, it seemed to come from the center of the world itself. He'd been replacing another loose fence post when the ground beneath him started to hum with strange energy. Duchess snorted nervously and danced sideways, her ears flicking back and forth. Animals always knew about earthquakes before people did, Martha used to say. They could sense things humans missed, feel warnings written in languages older than words. The rumbling grew stronger. Jacob grabbed the fence post to steady himself as the earth began to sway like the deck of a ship in rough seas. The sound reminded him of distant thunder, but thunder that came from below instead of above. "Easy, girl," Jacob called to Duchess, though his own voice shook with uncertainty. "Just hold on." The earthquake lasted maybe 30 seconds, but time moved strangely when the solid ground turned liquid. Seconds stretched into minutes. Minutes felt like hours. Jacob watched his world transform as rocks tumbled down hillsides and trees swayed without any wind. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. Silence returned to the Montana plains, but it felt different now. Heavier, changed, like the quiet that follows a lightning strike when the air itself holds its breath. Jacob released his death grip on the fence post and looked around for damage. A few stones had rolled down the nearby slope, and dust hung in the air like morning fog. But overall, his land appeared intact. That's when he saw it. 50 yards away, near the base of the hill where he'd been working all morning, a crack had opened in the earth. Not just any crack, a clean split that ran in a straight line for about 10 feet, as if some giant had drawn a pencil mark across the landscape. Jacob approached slowly, curiosity overcoming caution. The crack was maybe 3 feet wide at its widest point, but it seemed to go deeper than he could see from the surface. When he knelt at the edge and peered down, cool air drifted up to touch his face. "Well, I'll be," he whispered. The crack wasn't just a surface split caused by the earthquake. It had opened something that was already there, something that had been waiting beneath his land for who knew how long. Jacob dropped a small stone into the opening and listened. The sound echoed back after several seconds, suggesting the space below extended much deeper than expected. The cool air rising from within carried an odd scent, metallic and ancient, like old coins left in a forgotten drawer. Duchess whinnied softly behind him, reminding Jacob that he wasn't alone. The mare had stayed close despite the earthquake, proof of the trust they'd built over years of working together. She was the closest thing to family he had left. "What do you think, girl?" Jacob asked, stroking her neck. "Should we see what Mother Earth decided to show us today?" The horse nuzzled his shoulder, which he took as encouragement. Jacob tied Duchess to a sturdy sagebrush and walked around the crack, examining it from different angles. The split appeared natural on top, caused by the earthquake's force, but something about the edges looked too smooth, too deliberate. He picked up a larger rock and dropped it into the opening. This time, instead of a simple thud, he heard what sounded like the stone bouncing off walls, multiple echoes that suggested the space below had shape and structure. The afternoon sun had moved enough that its light no longer reached directly into the crack. Jacob would need a lantern if he wanted to explore further. But did he want to? The sensible thing would be to cover the hole and forget about it. Curiosity had gotten plenty of men into trouble over the years. On the other hand, this was his land, his discovery. Whatever lay beneath the surface belonged to him by right of ownership and by right of finding it. After 3 years of having nothing new happen in his life, maybe a little adventure wouldn't hurt. Jacob made up his mind. He'd return tomorrow with proper equipment, rope, lantern, maybe some food and water in case exploring took longer than expected. Tonight, he'd plan carefully. Adventures were for young fools who couldn't imagine consequences. 42-year-old widowers needed to think things through. He gathered some loose stones and built a small cairn next to the crack, marking its location in case the light changed and made it harder to find later. The last thing he wanted was to accidentally step into his own discovery in the dark. As he worked, Jacob noticed something else. The earthquake had done more than just crack the ground. It had shifted some of the surface stones around the area, revealing patches of earth that hadn't seen sunlight in years. In one of these newly exposed spots, something glinted in the afternoon sun. Jacob brushed away loose dirt and found a small piece of metal, green with age but clearly worked by human hand. It looked like part of a tool or ornament, though unlike anything he'd seen before. The metal felt strange in his palm, heavier than it should be for its size, and warm, despite having been buried in cool earth. Symbols were etched into its surface, worn but still visible. They didn't look like any writing Jacob recognized from his limited education. He slipped the artifact into his shirt pocket and stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. The crack in the ground suddenly seemed less like a simple earthquake damage and more like a doorway that had been waiting for the right moment to open. The sun was beginning its journey toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. Soon, darkness would make any exploration dangerous. Jacob needed to get home, gather supplies, and think about what he'd stumbled onto. As he untied Duchess and prepared to leave, a movement on the distant ridge caught his eye. A rider sat motionless against the skyline, too far away to identify but close enough to be watching. The figure remained perfectly still for several long moments, then turned and disappeared over the ridge. Jacob frowned. Riders didn't usually travel this far from town without good reason, and they certainly didn't sit on ridges watching other people's land. Maybe someone else had felt the earthquake and come to check for damage. Or maybe word of the crack had somehow spread already. Small towns were like spider webs. Every vibration got felt by everyone connected to the network. If someone had seen the earthquake's effects from a distance, curiosity might have drawn them closer for a look. Jacob mounted Duchess and headed home, but he kept glancing back toward the ridge where the mysterious rider had appeared. The afternoon felt different now, charged with possibility and tinged with caution. Behind him, the crack in the earth waited in patient silence, holding its secrets for one more night. The rope burned against Jacob's palms as he lowered himself into the darkness for the third time that week. His boots scraped against stone walls that felt smoother than anything nature could carve. The September air above ground had been warm, but down here, cold breath seemed to whisper from deeper in the tunnel. Jacob's lantern cast dancing shadows on walls, covered with markings he'd never seen before. Lines and circles twisted together like some kind of writing, but not like the English words he knew from his few years of schooling. These symbols looked older than anything he could imagine. "Easy does it," he whispered to himself, the same words he used when breaking wild horses. But his heart hammered like a woodpecker against oak bark. 20 feet down, the narrow crack opened into something that made Jacob's breath catch in his throat. A room. Not a cave, but an actual room with corners and a flat ceiling. Someone had built this place. Someone had carved every inch of it by hand. Jacob held his lantern high and stepped forward on shaking legs. The light revealed pottery sitting on stone shelves, as if someone had just stepped out for a moment. Clay pots with painted designs showed animals he recognized: buffalo, eagles, bears, but also creatures that looked like nothing he'd ever seen. Along one wall, weapons hung from carved hooks, not guns or rifles, but spears with metal points that gleamed like silver in his lantern light. The metal didn't look rusty or old. It looked like it had been polished yesterday. But what stopped Jacob cold were the paintings on the far wall. Pictures told a story in bright colors that somehow hadn't faded despite the dampness. People in strange clothes worked the land above his ranch. They built houses and grew crops and raised families. Children played games, while adults crafted beautiful things with their hands. In the center of the largest painting, a woman with long black hair held something small and glowing in her cupped palms. Around her, people knelt as if she were showing them something precious, something important. Jacob moved closer, studying the woman's face. She looked kind but serious, like his mother had looked when teaching him important lessons. Behind her, the painted landscape looked exactly like his ranch land. The same rolling hills, the same distant mountains. These people had lived right here, right where he now struggled to grow enough crops to survive. A stone table sat in the room's center, covered with carved symbols that matched the ones on the walls. Jacob set his lantern down and ran his fingers over the smooth surface. The stone felt warm, which didn't make sense in the cool underground air. Something else caught his attention: a rectangular outline carved into the table's center. It looked like a lid or cover. Jacob pushed against it, but nothing happened. He tried lifting from different angles, but the stone wouldn't budge. Then he noticed smaller symbols around the outline's edges. They looked different from the others, simpler somehow. Jacob studied them carefully, comparing them to the wall paintings. In one picture, he saw the same symbols carved into a similar stone surface. His pulse quickened as he realized what he was looking at. This wasn't just a table. It was a container, a stone chest built right into the table itself. Jacob searched the room for anything that might help him open it. Behind the pottery, he found metal tools unlike anything he'd seen before. They weren't rusty like old farming equipment. These tools looked perfect, as if they'd been made yesterday. He selected one that looked like it might fit into a small groove near the chest's edge. The tool slid in perfectly, and Jacob heard a soft click. He tried another groove, then another. Each time, the mechanism seemed to respond. After fitting tools into 6 different grooves, Jacob heard a sound like distant thunder. The stone lid shifted slightly. His hands trembling with excitement and fear, Jacob pushed against it again. This time, it moved. The lid slid back with surprising ease, revealing a hollow space lined with what looked like silver. Inside, wrapped in cloth that should have rotted away long ago, lay objects that made Jacob's mind spin. Maps, drawn on material that felt like leather, but looked like metal. The maps showed not just his land, but vast areas stretching across what Jacob knew as Montana Territory, Wyoming, and beyond. Tiny symbols marked locations throughout the region, suggesting other places like this one. Beneath the maps lay flat pieces of metal covered with the same strange writing he'd seen on the walls. The metal plates felt warm in his hands and seemed to glow faintly in the lantern light. Jacob couldn't read the symbols, but somehow they felt important. Urgent, even. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped separately, sat a small carved figure, a woman holding something in her hands, just like in the wall painting. But this wasn't made of stone or clay. This figure appeared to be carved from some kind of crystal that caught his lantern light and threw it back in rainbow colors. Jacob picked up the figure and nearly dropped it again. For just a moment, he could have sworn he heard voices, not from above ground, but from all around him. Whispers in a language he didn't know, but somehow understood. They were trying to tell him something. Something about danger coming from the east. Something about protecting what he'd found. Jacob shook his head, telling himself it was just his imagination. Too many hours underground were making him hear things that weren't there. But as he carefully rewrapped the crystal figure, the whispering continued. He packed everything back into the chest and closed the lid. The locking mechanism reset itself with another soft click. Whatever secrets this place held, Jacob knew they were bigger than anything he could handle alone. As he climbed back toward daylight, Jacob's mind raced with questions. Who were these people? Where had they gone? And why did he feel like someone was watching him from the shadows? The woman arrived on Jacob's porch like morning mist, quiet and unexpected, but impossible to ignore. Her travel-worn brown dress and practical boots marked her as someone used to rough country, not the fancy ladies who occasionally passed through town. But her eyes held a sharpness that made Jacob step back from his doorway. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, adjusting the leather satchel slung across her shoulder. "My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez. I've traveled from Washington to speak with you about your recent discovery." Jacob's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle leaning against his doorframe. "Don't know what you're talking about, ma'am." Elena smiled, but her expression remained serious. "Mr. Hartwell, I work for the Smithsonian Institution. We study old things that tell us about people who lived long ago. A friend of mine in town mentioned you'd found something unusual after the earthquake." "People in town talk too much," Jacob muttered, but he found himself curious despite his caution. What kind of old things? The kind that might explain why certain symbols keep appearing in archaeological sites across the Western Territories. Symbols that match descriptions of what you found beneath your land. Jacob's pulse quickened. She knew about the symbols. "You've seen markings like that before?" Elena opened her satchel and pulled out a leather notebook filled with sketches. She flipped to a page covered with drawings that made Jacob's blood run cold. The symbols looked exactly like the ones carved into his underground chamber. "These drawings come from sites in Arizona, New Mexico, and southern Colorado," Elena explained. "Each location shows evidence of an advanced civilization that lived here centuries before European settlers arrived. A civilization that seems to have vanished completely, leaving only these scattered traces." Jacob studied the notebook, his mind spinning. "How do you know I found anything?" "Because 3 other site discoveries have been reported in the past 5 years. Each time, within weeks of the discovery, the landowner either sold their property to railroad companies or disappeared entirely." Elena's voice dropped. "I'm here to make sure that doesn't happen to you." Something in her tone made Jacob step aside and gesture her into his small cabin. The main room held only basic furniture, a table, 2 chairs, and a wood stove. Elena looked around with professional interest, her eyes taking in details like someone trained to notice important things. "Coffee?" Jacob offered, mostly to give himself time to think. "Thank you." Elena sat at his table and opened her notebook again. "Mr. Hartwell, I need to ask you directly. Have you found an underground chamber containing artifacts and wall paintings?" Jacob poured coffee into 2 tin cups, his hands steady despite his racing thoughts. "What if I had?" "Then you've discovered something that could change how we understand the history of this entire region," And that makes you very valuable to some people, and very dangerous to others. Jacob set a cup in front of her and sat down. Dangerous how? Elena pulled out a newspaper clipping from her satchel. The headline read, "Mysterious Fire Destroys Ranch Near Tucson." Below it, a smaller article, "Landowner Missing After Selling Property to Railroad Interests." "This is what happened to the last person who found a site like yours," Elena said quietly. "The man discovered an underground chamber filled with artifacts. Within a month, railroad representatives were offering to buy his land. When he refused, his ranch burned down under suspicious circumstances. He was never seen again." Jacob felt cold despite the warm coffee. "You think someone killed him?" "I think someone wanted what he found badly enough to remove any obstacles, and I think you're about to face the same situation." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses drifted through Jacob's window. Both he and Elena moved to look outside, where 3 men on horseback were riding up his dusty lane. The lead rider wore an expensive black suit that looked out of place in ranch country. "That's Cornelius Blake," Elena whispered, her face pale. "He's a railroad magnate from Chicago. If he's here, it means word of your discovery has already reached very powerful people." Jacob grabbed his rifle from beside the door. "What does he want?" "Everything you found. And he's not the kind of man who accepts no for an answer." Blake dismounted with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. His 2 companions remained on horseback, hands resting near the weapons on their belts. Jacob noticed they weren't ordinary cowboys. These men had the hard look of professional gunfighters. "Mr. Hartwell," Blake called out as he approached the porch. "I'm Cornelius Blake, representing the Montana Western Railroad Company. I believe we have business to discuss." Jacob stepped outside, rifle held casually but ready. "I'm not looking to sell, if that's what you're here about." Blake's smile never reached his eyes. "Oh, I think you'll find my offer quite generous, especially considering the complications that can arise from certain types of discoveries on private land." "What kind of complications?" "Well, for instance, territorial authorities might decide that items of historical significance should be managed by more qualified parties. Court battles can drag on for years, during which time a man might find it difficult to work his land or make a living." Elena appeared in the doorway behind Jacob. Blake's expression shifted when he saw her. "Dr. Vasquez," Blake said with false warmth, "I should have known you'd be here. Still chasing your academic fantasies, I see." "Still stealing from people who can't fight back, I see," Elena replied coolly. Blake's smile disappeared. "The railroad company is prepared to offer Mr. Hartwell $50,000 for his property. Cash payment, immediate transfer. That's more money than a small rancher could make in 20 years. Jacob felt the weight of the offer. $50,000 was more money than he'd ever dreamed of having. He could buy a bigger ranch somewhere else, maybe closer to town. He could start over completely. But something in Blake's eager expression made him suspicious. If the land was worth $50,000 to Blake, it was probably worth much more. "I need time to think about it," Jacob said. Blake's jaw tightened. "Time has a way of running out, Mr. Hartwell. Opportunities like this don't come along often, and sometimes, when people wait too long to make smart decisions, they find themselves with fewer options." The threat was clear. Though Blake had been careful not to say anything directly illegal, his 2 hired guns shifted in their saddles, making their presence felt. "Mr. Blake," Elena stepped forward, "I should mention that this site has already been registered with federal authorities as a location of archaeological significance. Any attempt to disturb or damage it would be a federal crime." Blake's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Federal authorities are a long way from here, Doctor. A lot can happen before any federal marshals arrive." Jacob felt the tension crackling between the 3 adults like lightning before a storm. He was caught between Elena's scientific interest and Blake's obvious threats, with his own future hanging in the balance. "I'll give you 3 days to consider my offer," Blake said, mounting his horse. "After that, things might become more complicated." As the three men rode away, Elena turned to Jacob with worry clear on her face. Jacob, you can't trust him. Whatever you found down there, it's important enough that he's willing to kill for it. Jacob looked toward the crack in the hillside, where his discovery lay hidden. Then maybe it's time I learned exactly what I found. Blake's polished black carriage rolled up Jacob's dirt road like a storm cloud, bringing trouble. The man who stepped out wore clothes that cost more than most folks saw in a year, but his smile was colder than a Montana winter morning. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell," Blake called out, his voice smooth as snake oil. Two rough-looking men climbed down after him, their hands resting easy on their gun belts. "Beautiful day to discuss business, don't you think?" Jacob set down his coffee cup and walked to the edge of his porch. Something about this man made his skin crawl. "Depends on what kind of business you're talking about, Mr. Blake." Cornelius Blake, of the Western Railroad Company. The man's eyes swept across Jacob's small ranch like he was already counting money. "I've heard some mighty interesting stories about your land lately." Elena appeared in the doorway behind Jacob, her notebook still in her hands. She'd been working since dawn, copying the strange symbols they'd found in the tunnel. "What kind of stories?" she asked. Blake's smile got wider, showing too many teeth. "The kind that makes smart men very rich, miss." "Dr. Vasquez," Elena said firmly, "and I don't think we've invited you onto this property." Now, Blake chuckled, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "No need for unfriendly words. I'm here to make Mr. Hartwell the deal of a lifetime." Jacob felt his stomach tighten. "My land's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, friend. It's just a matter of finding the right price." Blake unfolded the paper with a flourish. "I'm prepared to offer you $3,000 for these 200 acres. Cash money. Right here. Right now." The number hit Jacob like a punch to the gut. $3,000 was more money than he'd see in 10 years of ranching. It was enough to start over somewhere else, maybe buy a bigger spread in California, where the soil was better. But Elena stepped forward, her dark eyes flashing. "That's interesting, Mr. Blake. What makes you think this particular piece of land is worth so much?" Blake's friendly mask slipped for just a moment, showing something ugly underneath. "Well, I've heard rumors about historical items being found here. Artifacts, you might say." "What kind of artifacts?" Jacob asked, though he already knew the answer. "The kind that belong in proper museums, not buried in some rancher's backyard." Blake signaled to his men, who moved closer to the porch. "The kind that could make a man very uncomfortable if the wrong people started asking questions." Elena's hand moved to the small pistol she kept in her belt. "Are you threatening us, Mr. Blake?" "Threatening?" Blake laughed, but the sound had no warmth in it. "My dear woman, I'm trying to help. You see, territorial law can be complicated when it comes to things like this. A simple rancher might find himself tied up in courts for years, fighting expensive legal battles he can't afford." Jacob felt anger building in his chest, like a fire catching dry wood. "Get off my land! Now. Let's not be hasty." Blake pulled out a thick roll of bills. $4,000. Final offer. "I said get off my land!" Jacob's hand dropped to his own gun. Blake's men tensed, their fingers twitching near their weapons. For a moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the fence posts. Then Blake smiled again, but this time it was like looking at a rattlesnake. "You know, Hartwell, I've done some checking on you. Sad story about your wife. Martha, wasn't it? Died of fever 3 winters ago?" Jacob's vision went red around the edges. "Don't you dare. Left you all alone out here with nothing but debt and bad memories." Blake's voice turned silky. "Neighbors don't think much of a man who can't protect his own family, do they?" "That's enough," Elena snapped, stepping between them. But Blake wasn't finished. "See, that's the thing about rumors, Hartwell. They spread fast in small communities. People might start wondering what else you're hiding out here. Might start asking uncomfortable questions about property lines, water rights, maybe even how your wife really died." The words hit Jacob like physical blows. Every fear he'd carried for 3 years, every whispered conversation he'd imagined behind his back, suddenly felt real and sharp as broken glass. "You're a sick man," Elena said quietly. Blake shrugged. "I'm a practical man, doctor. And practically speaking, Mr. Hartwell here has 2 choices. He can take my generous offer and start fresh somewhere else, or he can try to fight me and lose everything anyway." "There's a third choice," came a voice from behind them. Everyone turned to see Sheriff Tom Rodriguez riding up the path, his badge catching the morning sun. Jacob had never been so happy to see the lawman in his life. "Morning, Tom," Jacob called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Jacob." "Ma'am." The sheriff touched his hat to Elena, then fixed his steel-gray eyes on Blake. "And you would be?" "Cornelius Blake, Sheriff. Just conducting some business with Mr. Hartwell here." Rodriguez dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling in the quiet air. "Funny thing, Mr. Blake. I got a telegram this morning from the territorial governor's office. Seems there's been some official interest in this property lately." Blake's confident expression flickered. "Official interest? The kind that comes from Washington, D.C. Rodriguez pulled a folded telegram from his shirt pocket. "Seems Dr. Vasquez here filed some papers with the Smithsonian Institution. This land is now under federal protection as a site of historical importance." Elena smiled for the first time that morning. "I sent that telegram 3 days ago, Mr. Blake. While you were making your plans, we were making ours." Blake's face went pale, then red with anger. "This is ridiculous. You can't just—" "I can, and I did," Rodriguez said firmly. "Federal law trumps territorial law, Mr. Blake, and federal agents don't take kindly to folks who try to intimidate citizens on protected land." "This isn't over," Blake snarled, motioning to his men. "There are ways around federal protection. Paperwork gets lost. Accidents happen." "Is that a threat, Mr. Blake?" Rodriguez asked, his hand resting on his gun butt. Blake straightened his expensive coat and climbed back into his carriage. "It's a promise, Sheriff. Good day, gentlemen." "Ma'am." As the carriage rolled away, Jacob felt his knees go weak. He grabbed the porch railing to steady himself. "You did good, Jacob," Rodriguez said quietly. "That man's got a reputation from here to Denver. Folks who cross him tend to have bad luck." "What kind of bad luck?" Elena asked. "The kind that involves mysterious fires and unfortunate accidents." The sheriff's voice was grim. "You two need to watch your backs. Blake doesn't give up easy, and he's got friends in high places." The sun was setting like blood across the western sky when Jacob and Elena finally returned to the tunnel. They'd spent the afternoon hiding the most precious artifacts in different locations around the ranch, just in case Blake decided to come back with more men. "Hand me that lantern," Elena whispered as they descended into the cool darkness of the underground chamber. The mysterious stone chest sat exactly where they'd left it, covered in symbols that seemed to dance in the flickering light. For 3 days, they'd been trying to figure out how to open it without damaging whatever was inside. "Look at this," Elena said, running her fingers along the carved edges. "These aren't just decorations. They're instructions." Jacob held the light closer. "Instructions for what?" "Opening the chest, I think. See how the symbols form a pattern? It's like a puzzle." Elena traced the carvings with her finger. "This symbol here appears on the wall murals too. And this one matches the pottery we found yesterday." A cool breeze drifted through the tunnel, making the lantern flame flicker. Jacob shivered, but not from the cold. Ever since they discovered this place, he'd felt like they were being watched by invisible eyes. "Elena," he said quietly, "what if we're making a mistake? What if this chest was sealed for a reason?" She looked up at him, her eyes bright with excitement. "Jacob, this could be the discovery of the century. Whatever's in here, it was important enough for an entire civilization to preserve. But what if they were preserving it because it was dangerous?" Elena paused, her hand still on the stone surface. "Dangerous how? I don't know, but I've been having dreams since we found this place. Strange dreams about people I've never seen before, speaking languages I don't understand." Jacob set the lantern down carefully. What if there's a reason this place was buried? Dreams can't hurt you, Jacob. Can't they? He looked around the chamber, at the murals showing scenes of a great city, of people performing unknown rituals, of something terrible happening that drove them underground. Look at these paintings. These people were running from something. Elena studied the walls more carefully. In the lantern light, the painted figures did seem to be fleeing. Men, women, and children carrying bundles, looking back over their shoulders with fear in their eyes. Maybe they were running from disease, she suggested, or drought, or war with other tribes. Maybe. Or maybe they were running from something they couldn't fight. Jacob picked up a piece of broken pottery from the floor. Elena, what if we're about to let something out that should stay locked up? Before Elena could answer, they heard a sound from above. The creak of wagon wheels and the low murmur of men's voices. Blake? Jacob breathed. Elena blew out the lantern, plunging them into complete darkness. How many men do you think he brought? Too many. Jacob felt for his gun, grateful he'd started wearing it again after Blake's morning visit. There's another way out of here. I found it yesterday while you were working on those pottery pieces. Another tunnel? More like a crack in the rock wall. It's narrow, but it opens up near the creek. Jacob grabbed Elena's hand. We need to take the chest with us. Jacob, it's too heavy for just the two of us. Then we open it here. Take what's inside, and leave the rest. Elena felt around in the darkness until her hands found the carved symbols again. All right. But if something terrible happens, it's on both our heads. She began pressing the symbols in the order she'd figured out from studying the wall paintings. Each one clicked softly as it moved, like puzzle pieces falling into place. The voices above were getting closer. Jacob could hear boots on his porch, the sound of his front door being kicked in. Hurry, he whispered. Elena pressed the final symbol, and the chest opened with a sound like sighing wind. Inside, wrapped in cloth that should have rotted away centuries ago, were objects that made Jacob's breath catch in his throat. Maps. Dozens of them, drawn on some kind of metal that gleamed like silver, but felt warm to the touch. And beneath the maps, something that made Elena gasp with wonder. A collection of metal plates covered in the same strange writing they'd seen throughout the tunnel. Jacob, she breathed. These aren't just artifacts. They're records. A complete history of the people who lived here. Can you read them? Not yet, but given time. Elena carefully lifted one of the plates. In the dim light filtering down from above, the symbols seemed to glow with their own inner fire. Jacob, this is bigger than we thought. Much bigger. The sound of men descending into the tunnel made them both freeze. Light from torches began to flicker on the chamber walls. This way, Jacob whispered, leading Elena toward the crack in the rock wall he'd discovered. They gathered up as many of the metal plates as they could carry, leaving the maps behind with bitter regret. As they squeezed through the narrow opening, Jacob heard Blake's voice echo through the chamber behind them. Well, well, looks like our friends have been busy. The crack in the wall was barely wide enough for one person at a time, and Elena's dress kept catching on the rough stone. Behind them, they could hear Blake's men searching the chamber, their angry voices growing louder. There's another way out, one of the men called. Fresh air coming from this crack over here. Then follow them, Blake snapped. I want those artifacts, and I want them tonight. Jacob and Elena emerged from the crack near the creek, gasping in the cool night air. The metal plates they'd rescued were heavy, but Jacob knew they were worth more than all the gold in Colorado. We need to get these to the sheriff, Elena panted. No, Jacob said firmly. We need to get them somewhere safe first. Somewhere Blake and his men will never think to look. Where? Jacob looked across his land, at the small cemetery where Martha lay buried beneath a simple wooden cross. I know a place where nobody will disturb them. As they made their way through the darkness, carrying the precious records of a lost civilization, Jacob felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. The weight of responsibility for something truly important. Behind them, torchlight flickered in the tunnel entrance as Blake's men began their pursuit. The sound of horses pounding across frozen ground woke Jacob before dawn. Through his cabin window, He watched a line of torches moving like angry fireflies toward his ranch. Blake had returned with more than just his 2 hired guns this time. Jacob grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch. The cold September air bit at his face as he counted at least 8 riders surrounding his property. Their leader sat tall in his saddle, a silver star gleaming on his coat. "Jacob Hartwell," the man called out. "I'm Marshal Peters from Helena. You need to come out here and talk." Elena emerged from the guest room, her hair hastily pinned up and her traveling dress wrinkled from sleep. She carried the leather bag containing their precious documents and photographs of the tunnel artifacts. "They can't just take the land," she whispered, but her voice shook with worry. Jacob opened the door slowly. "Marshal, this is my property. What brings you here before sunrise?" Marshal Peters dismounted, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. Behind him, Blake sat smugly on his horse, wrapped in an expensive fur coat that looked out of place in the rough Montana territory. "Mr. Blake here has filed a legal claim with the territorial government," Peters said, unfolding an official-looking paper. "Says you've been hiding valuable artifacts that belong to the people of Montana Territory. Not one man." Elena stepped forward, clutching her bag tighter. "That's not how archaeological law works, Marshal. The landowner has first rights to anything found on their property." Blake laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the empty pasture. "Tell that to the territorial judge, lady. I've got connections in Helena that go all the way to Washington. This ranch is going to be seized for the public good." Jacob felt his hands tremble, but not from cold. 3 years of grief and loneliness had taught him something about standing his ground when everything seemed lost. "You want to see what's down there so badly, Blake? Fine. But you're going to do it legal-like." The marshal looked confused. What's he talking about? Elena smiled for the first time since the riders had arrived. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. This arrived yesterday evening by special courier from Washington, D.C. The Smithsonian Institution has officially designated this site as a federal archaeological preserve under the American Antiquities Act. Blake's face turned red as a prairie sunset. "That's impossible," the telegraph lines. "Work both ways," Elena interrupted. "While you were busy filing false territorial claims, we were documenting everything properly with federal authorities. Dr. Morrison from the Smithsonian will arrive next week with a full team of researchers." The marshal studied the documents Elena handed him. His eyebrows rose higher with each page he read. "This here's got official seals from 3 different government departments. Says Mr. Hartwell is appointed as the legal guardian of this site." One of Blake's hired men shifted nervously in his saddle. "Boss, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Blake snapped. He turned his angry gaze on Jacob. "You think some papers from back east will protect you out here? This is the frontier, Hartwell. Things happen to men who don't know their place." Jacob stepped down from his porch, rifle held loosely but ready. "My place is right here, Blake. On my land, protecting what belongs here." The tension stretched like a wire, about to snap. The hired guns looked uncertain now, glancing between Blake and the marshal. Even they knew that threatening a federal archaeological site would bring more trouble than any amount of money was worth. Marshal Peters folded the documents carefully. "Mr. Blake, these papers look genuine to me. I suggest you take your business elsewhere." "This isn't over," Blake snarled, pulling his horse around. "You can't hide behind government papers forever, Hartwell. Sooner or later, you'll be alone again." As the riders disappeared into the gray dawn light, Elena sagged against the porch railing. "That was closer than I wanted it to be." Jacob watched the dust settle where Blake's men had been. He's not wrong about one thing. When you and the other researchers leave, I'll be alone here again. What happens when Blake comes back with different papers or different men? Elena turned to look at him, and Jacob saw something in her eyes that made his heart skip. What if you didn't have to be alone? Before he could ask what she meant, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble again. Not the violent shaking of the earthquake that had opened the tunnel, but a gentle vibration that seemed to come from deep underground. The chamber, Elena whispered. "Something's happening down there." They hurried to the tunnel entrance, where their rope ladders still hung into the darkness. The vibration grew stronger as they descended, and when they reached the artifact chamber, they found something impossible. The stone chest they had opened and emptied days before was glowing with a soft blue light. The mysterious symbols carved into the walls pulsed with the same gentle radiance, as if the ancient chamber was somehow alive and responding to the conflict above. "Jacob," Elena breathed, "I think this place has been waiting for someone who would protect it, not profit from it." As they stood in the otherworldly glow, Jacob realized that discovering the tunnel had changed more than just his understanding of history. It had changed his understanding of himself. For the first time since Martha's death, he didn't feel like a failure. He felt like a guardian. The autumn sun painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson, as Jacob stood at the edge of his transformed world. 3 weeks had passed since Blake's failed attempt to seize the ranch, and the landscape around the tunnel site bustled with activity that would have seemed impossible just a month ago. Dr. Morrison had arrived from the Smithsonian with a team of 6 researchers, their white canvas tents dotting the pasture like strange flowers blooming in the prairie grass. The sound of careful excavation work drifted up from the expanded tunnel entrance, where they had discovered not just one chamber, but an entire underground complex. Elena emerged from the largest tent, her hands stained with clay from cataloging pottery fragments. Her hair had grown longer during her extended stay, and she had traded her formal Eastern traveling dress for practical work clothes that suited the frontier life better than Jacob would have expected. "The symbols on the deeper walls," she said, approaching with excitement dancing in her eyes. "We've figured out what they mean. It's not just decoration, Jacob. It's a record. A history of people who lived here for over 300 years. Jacob set down the fence post he had been preparing to install. The expansion of the archaeological site meant extending his property boundaries, something he never could have afforded before the government payments started arriving for housing the research team. 300 years, he repeated. That means they were here long before any European ever saw this land. Exactly. And the most amazing part is how they lived. The artifacts show they had trade relationships with tribes from as far away as the Pacific coast and the Gulf of Mexico. They weren't just survivors scraping by in the wilderness. They were sophisticated people with art, technology, and culture. As Elena spoke, Jacob watched her animated gestures and bright smile. Somewhere between fighting off Blake's threats and uncovering ancient mysteries, he had stopped thinking of her as a visiting scholar and started thinking of her as something much more important. A rider appeared on the horizon, approaching at an easy pace that suggested good news rather than trouble. Jacob recognized Tom Brennan, the telegrapher from the nearest town, whose weekly visits had become a welcome routine. "Afternoon, Mr. Hartwell, Miss Elena," Tom called out, dismounting near the porch. "Got some interesting news from back east." Elena accepted the telegram with hands that trembled slightly. As she read, her face went through a series of expressions that Jacob couldn't quite interpret. "What is it?" he asked. "The National Geographic Society wants to send a photographer and writer to document the site," she said slowly. "And the Smithsonian is asking if I would consider taking a permanent position as the site supervisor." Jacob felt his stomach drop. Permanent position here? Or back in Washington? Elena looked up at him with eyes that held questions he wasn't sure he was brave enough to answer. "Here, Jacob. They want to establish a permanent research station. Someone would need to stay year-round to oversee the work and protect the site." The silence stretched between them like the vast Montana sky overhead. Jacob had grown comfortable with Elena's presence over the weeks, but he hadn't dared to hope it might be more than temporary. The lonely rancher who had discovered the tunnel felt like a different person from the man who stood here now, surrounded by purpose and possibility. "What about your life back east?" he asked quietly. Elena smiled, the same warm expression that had first made him trust her weeks ago. "What life? I have colleagues in Washington, but no family, no real home. I've spent my whole career studying dead civilizations from a distance. This is the first time I've ever felt like I was part of something alive and important. Dr. Morrison appeared from the tunnel entrance, brushing dirt from his hands and grinning with the enthusiasm of a man half his age. Elena, Jacob, you need to see what we've found in the deepest chamber. They followed him down the expanded wooden stairs that had replaced Jacob's original rope ladder. The tunnel system now glowed with electric lights powered by a generator the research team had brought from Helena, transforming the mysterious underground world into something that felt both ancient and modern. The deepest chamber took Jacob's breath away. The walls were covered with intricate murals depicting scenes of daily life from the vanished civilization. But what made Dr. Morrison so excited was the center of the room, where they had uncovered a circular stone platform covered with symbols that seemed to move and shift in the electric light. It's a calendar, Dr. Morrison explained, his voice echoing in the spacious chamber. But not just any calendar. This tracks celestial events with accuracy that matches our modern astronomical instruments. These people understood the movements of stars and planets better than Europeans did until the Renaissance. Elena knelt beside the platform, running her fingers over the carved symbols with reverent care. Jacob, do you understand what this means? Your tunnel isn't just an archaeological site. It's proof that America had advanced civilizations long before Columbus. This discovery will rewrite history books around the world. As Jacob looked around the illuminated chamber, filled with evidence of human achievement and ingenuity, he realized something profound had happened to him over these weeks. The lonely man who had hidden from the world after his wife's death had become someone who helped bridge the ancient world with the modern one. Elena, he said quietly, would you stay? Not just for the research, but... She stood up, clay dust on her work dress and lamplight, catching the gold flecks in her brown eyes. Are you asking me to stay for the archaeology, or for something else? Jacob took off his hat, the same gesture he had made every morning for 3 years while contemplating his empty life. But this time, it felt like a beginning instead of an ending. Both, he said simply. I spent 3 years thinking I had failed at everything that mattered. Turns out I was just waiting for the right time to discover what I was actually meant to protect. Elena stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the scent of sage and earth that had become as familiar as Montana sunshine. And what's that? This place, these secrets, and if you'll let me, whatever future we might build together above this ancient ground. When she kissed him, gentle and sure in the glow of 1,000-year-old murals, Jacob understood that some discoveries change everything. The earthquake that had cracked open his land had also cracked open possibilities he never could have imagined. As autumn deepened into winter, the research station grew into a small community. The tunnel complex revealed new chambers and artifacts regularly, each discovery adding to the picture of a remarkable civilization that had thrived in the American West, centuries before history books claimed it was possible. Jacob and Elena were married the following spring, in a ceremony attended by researchers, neighbors, and government officials who had come to recognize the tunnel site as one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in North American history. But on quiet evenings, when the researchers had retired to their tents, and the electric lights in the tunnel were dimmed for the night, Jacob would stand on his porch and look out over the land that had taught him the most important lesson of his life. Worth wasn't something other people could give you or take away. It was something you discovered when you stopped hiding from the world and started protecting what mattered most. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that protection led to connections deeper and more lasting than anything you had ever dared to dream. The silence that had once defined his days was gone forever, replaced by the sounds of ongoing discovery and the quiet conversations of a love that had grown from shared purpose into something as enduring as the ancient stones beneath their feet.